up next, the fun doesn't stop here, guys. Up next, we have another panel coming up. This time talking about the future of pharma and digital health. It's a star-studded lineup. So I will, if you are in the audience, jump on over to the link in the from the agenda side, and I will set up our new panelists right here, right now. Hello, everybody.
Hey, Julia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you great. I'm just giving you guys video access now.
There we go.
Bear with. Yeah, it takes a few clicks around to get it up and running, but here we go.
Okay.
Perfect. There is everybody. Thank you so much for joining you guys today. I will not take up any time dilly-dallying at the start. I will hand it right over to you, Vaibhav, to get this panel started.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here. Welcome to the HITLAB Innovator Summit. Today, we're going to be talking about future of pharma and digital health. Sounds interesting, right? Before we start that, by way of introduction, my name is Vaibhav Srivastava. I run the pharma business for Persistent Systems, which is a digital engineering firm delivering transformational programs for our customers for the last 30 years. Before we go into detail, I would really request our esteemed panel to introduce themselves briefly so that the audience could know them better. Maybe we'll start with Zina.
Yes, hi. So happy to join. My name is Zina Manji, and I'm Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at GlaxoSmithKline in the Consumer Healthcare Division, responsible for innovation.
Thank you, Zina. Pleasure to have you here. Next up, Sahab.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sahab. I lead data science product management at Merck in marketing division. At night, I teach at Berkeley and I also dive into angel investing in the evening.
Very nice. Look forward to our conversation today. And finally, I see Robert. Robert, why don't you go and introduce yourself?
Thank you, and good to be here this afternoon. My name is Robert Garber, and I'm a partner at Seven Wire Ventures based in Chicago, where I spend all of my time investing in building companies in early stage digital health with a particular focus on those solutions that allow us to be consumers and not patients. And so what do we do to put tools, technology, information in our hands so that we can actually make smarter choices and live healthier lives?
Very good. Nice to have you here, Robert. With that said, why don't we get into our topic and let our audience also hear what do you think about some of the future of pharma and how digital health is coming together. So maybe I'll start with digital health, right? As that's the main topic for the theme, right? How are you seeing in your lives, in your organizations, digital health bridging the gap between patients, doctors, or for that even pharma organizations, because that's also an area which is coming up pretty well nowadays. How do you see that? Maybe we'll start with Zina, and I'm gonna ask each of you guys over the period of time. Why don't we start with Zina?
Sure, thank you. Well, I really think digital health has, brought forward new opportunities that didn't exist before. And really through the technology, through the ability to engage with patients and consumers and within the healthcare system real time. So I think, the opportunity there is, of course, getting insights you didn't have before, looking at traditionally fixed trials at a certain point of time, and that's all the data you had. You have a doctor that talks to a patient and they see them, if they're lucky, every 6 months, maybe once a year. And in that 15-minute session, that's all the information they have from the patient. and they might be meeting with different doctors, and so you don't. So I think where the gap, the opportunity to bridge the gap and really accelerate is to understand patients more, understand consumers more in how they are experiencing their disease condition on a daily basis, on an individual basis. And really, how are they interacting with their treatments? If they are on treatments, how are they staying healthy and to avoid sickness and avoid flare of chronic disease states? So I think, in many cases, you will find new evidence on existing products that you didn't know before, just because of that interaction. And I think what we've been finding is that user interaction is so key. And that's where, digital health really gives you the opportunity to analyze that and really work through kind of understanding how, Glenn DeVries described the digital fabric, which we're now living in, and really talks about the whole consumer or the whole patient and how that interacts with the healthcare system and improving that. Where do you intercept with a patient or consumer on their healthcare journey, and how does that interface with the healthcare system and overall create that benefit? So I think how we bridge the gap is really looking at those points and using digital health to analyze where those benefits can come in, depending on your own company and what benefits and problems you're trying to solve.
No, makes sense, makes a lot of sense. And essentially making member patient as the center of the healthcare ecosystem, right?
Right.
Tracking around, but that makes a lot of sense. And maybe Robert, what are you seeing in the industry? How are we bringing bridging the gap between patients and doctors with the investments that you are making?
I certainly think it's still evolving. I agree with what Zena has said. I think, from an investment perspective, there's some categories, right? There's certainly digital health is highly impacting clinical trials as it pertains to pharma. I mean, the last couple of years, we've learned, sort of in real time how to conduct virtual trials at an accelerated pace. DTX is its own kind of, ball of wax when we're thinking about digital therapeutics and how pharma is understanding integration models with these software solutions that are challenging to fit into the traditional pharma model. I think, I was talking with one of the big pharma companies, and they're saying, like, it's great as long as we can put it into our existing therapeutic development pathway, right? Like clinical trials, published studies, outcomes, whatever, and reimbursement, and but they're struggling a bit to try and figure out. It's a little bit of a round peg in a square hole. And I think that's more a function of timing than anything. It's early days. I think we're seeing a pretty quick evolution that these solutions need to be adjunctive, right? They need to coexist, right? We lived in an all pharma world. We really quickly thought there was an all digital health, digital DTX world. And now I think we're seeing that these things are going to come together, and they're going to be combined therapies, which are designed, as you said, Zena, put the patient at the center of the universe, gather data, drive adherence, try and be proactive and preventative before somebody either has exacerbation or falls off their medication, because we weren't on top of understanding that there were side effects, there were problems with other medication they were taking, there was affordability issues, even the low-hanging fruit of why people don't adhere to meds becomes a lot easier to track in a digital world. But I think the models are still evolving, and the incentives and reimbursement is very much a work in process. So I don't think we know yet. We're seeing pharma as a bigger customer for many of our portfolio companies, where I think pharma feels like they know they need to be in the market, and their strategies are evolving quickly. But I think there's still a little bit of testing a number of different models of how that might work. So we'll see what it looks like in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Where I think it's a pretty steep learning curve right now from an industry perspective.
Right. Not true. It's a wave of digital transformation. You never know that 3, 4, 5 years could be 1 or 2 years, right?
Sure.
Hopefully. Moving forward to Sahab. Sahab, how are you in your organization and in your interactions? Are you seeing digital health bridging that gap? And maybe what examples are you seeing?
Yeah, I definitely see it. There is a desire to tap into digital health to improve patients' life, right? So my organization as a core, it surrounds around patients' well-being. So if anything, any digital health or companion app or supportive app improve therapy adherence, or can track adverse reactions and things like that, anything that supports our existing therapy, is definitely valuable for our patients. We want to make sure our patients get the most benefit, and this is where I see the most, focus at the moment. But as Robert said, like if you look at the industry wide, most pharma companies are focusing, things that are companion to their therapies. They're not really looking for DTX as a standalone at the moment. And I think a lot of it is comes from the fact that if you look at any pharmaceutical company, it takes a long time to develop a drug. And even if it gets through for one indication, there's a big process to get it approved for another indication. So they kind of rely on really hardcore science to know if this therapy is working as its own. I think this field is still new in terms of accepting as like, okay, this is a DTX as a standalone, pharmas would be willing to invest. But at the same time, the digital health is such a varied field. Like there are so many other opportunities, low-hanging fruits that pharma is going after. And those are making actually big impacts in patients' life. It doesn't require many years of commitment, going through validation, clinical validation for digital therapeutics. But if you go towards things that actually make a difference in patients' life, improve their quality of life, that's where you would see pharma going right now. But I'm hopeful, as Robert is, it will take a few years, and as soon as payers are going to recognize these digital therapeutics and start reimbursing, we may see a shift.
Okay, no, makes sense. We all hope so that this will bring in a lot of shift there. Now, let's say we talk about, in the end, what we're talking about is the member, the patient's interaction with the organizations, right? And there are various different interventions, there are various different interactions. Now, in the initiatives that you guys are seeing, which have started happening in your organizations, there are multiple variables in play. How are the ones which are making biggest impact? Is that something you guys are measuring and you are seeing a distinct impact being made on a certain areas? Maybe Zina will start with you.
Yeah, I think, taking a broader view here, I think when you're looking at where is the opportunity and what do you measure, right, as a kind of beginning point, I think it's really important to look at going back to basics. What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And how is that digital health tool solving that problem or contributing information to inform the solutions to that problem, or inform actions that the user should take or not take, or how does that interface with their doctor and how easily is that communicated and understood? I think that's all really critical and important. And does anyone care if that problem is solved, right? I mean, you might have great ideas for problems, but no one, there might be less interest in that. So I think that's the next layer. And then looking at what are the solutions, so the digital health solutions we're talking about in particular to address that problem. And talking about digital health in particular and medtech overall, engagement is key.
Yes.
And if you swallow a pill, it'll work, and you have to look at adherence and keep swallowing that pill. With med tech, it's not just the interaction and the adherence, it's full on engagement. And when you're measuring your evidence aspect and how you're going to gather that evidence. What level of engagement are you testing, and is that how much flex is there in that engagement? Someone engages very little, minimally, or does it have to be full on? That's actually also going to impact how usable and practical the solution will be. So I think when you're looking at value, it's really teasing that out in the first instance. And then secondly, it's looking at what are the multiple components of this treatment option. So in some cases, you will have medical device function. You can have non-medical device function. If you consider digital health as a medical device, there could be wellness app functions that aren't regulated but are lower risk, and that can all have multiple impacts and come together in the overall treatment or option that's given to the user. So understanding all of that is also really important. And I think that can then help you to determine, okay, what are the endpoints I'm looking at that I'm going to test? Right. And then what endpoints are those are meaningful to the outcome and how usable and engaging it is. And I think what we find is the easier it is for the user to understand, the easier it is for the clear benefit to come forward, the more likely you're going to have adoption and diffusion. And then I would say, start there. And then as you get information in real world, you get people engaging with the tool, you can then adapt and adjust and improve.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Sticking to the basic, adapting, and kind of understanding the feedback, right? And iterating with that feedback is where I think you're leading to. Sahab, do you also feel some of these are the key success factors, knowing the problem, understanding the feedback that you're getting and adapting to those feedbacks?
Yeah, I'll talk in general too. So if you look at the digital health, right, wellness app or DTX, it has a UX component to it. So yes. It's not as much different than Facebook if you're using it. So I think one of the challenge I think is that you can't really change UX that much. So do you have to go through the regulatory process again if you change that? So it's not. So even if the feedback loop is there, can you really apply all of that easily? Would it impact, the value of the app? And then there is that most of the apps that are out there that are very successful are targeted for consumers directly, especially in the wellness app. People go and use it, and it's just me interacting with it, and I'm getting the benefit. I think the challenge becomes when you have an app that is directly has a component that goes to your physician, and now you have to design some component of it that is valuable to physician as well as the patient, and it gets complicated. So those are some of the components that are difficult to solve for. And then at the end of the day, what's the lifetime for an app, right? Is it you need it for like 3 months, or do you need it for a chronic disease for a very long time? So I think these kind of skills aren't really there in pharma, because in pharma we have things we design, and we design we don't design apps. We come up with therapies and then we roll out so we are tapping it, and a lot of digital therapies that are there, they're tapping into UI, UX, and those kind of skills that are coming from other fields. So there's still a little bit of adaptation that is needed to make sure patients and physicians are finding the app valuable and sticking and using it for long term.
Okay, makes sense. Moving on to the next topic. And maybe Robert, we'll start with you. How this wave of digital transformation is bringing in so much of data, is creating so much of data. How you see this harnessing of data could be done, and what are the outcomes it can improve on? Like, can it improve on quality of life? How are you thinking that as a trend in the industry is basically harnessing the data and using it for some outcomes like quality of life? Have you seen that happen in the industry?
I mean, look, this is sort of the holy grail of what we hope will come, right? So this idea that all of these different devices that we carry around or wear or use have, digital exhaust, right? They're spitting off data, hopefully in a passive, more of a passive way than an active way. And it's sort of incumbent on the industry to make sense of that data and then integrate it into the clinical workflow. I think we're still early days there, but as you know, one of our early successes was Livongo, and it did a really nice job there, sort of gathering these data points from all different types of devices, whether it was a glucometer, a scale, a BP cuff, what have you, a wearable, and then trying to apply analytics to it to do real-time intervention. So really, there was like, how do we take action and create actionable information, right? So the data for data's sake is interesting, and creating longitudinal data to drive therapeutic interventions is necessary, but let's get actionable, let's get tangible. And I think that was an early example of how you can do it. In specific patient cases, say, all right, look, and I'll give you a really concrete example there, is like we could look in that situation where a person with diabetes started having questionable levels. And instead of waiting until they spun out into the ED, you could say, you know what, reach out, drink a glass of orange juice, walk around the street, walk around the block and retest your blood sugar, right? And pretty simple set of instructions that people can follow relatively easily. And it had a pretty material impact on improving outcomes, reducing exacerbations, and therefore improving quality of life, and reducing costs, right? So, anytime you avoid an ED, it's a pretty big cost saving for the system, but also for the patient. I think the other implications of data are, maybe right now still a little bit aspirational, but I think we need to move towards a more personalized approach to medicine, right? Today, we're very cohort based. If you look at two patients who share similar conditions, they're very likely, at least at the beginning of their care journey, to be treated fairly similarly. Whereas that which divides them is far greater than that which they have in common. And I think that's where this data can come in. I mean, a simple example I use is like the idea today that you go into your primary care doc, they take your BP and they tell you have hypertension based on that data point, right? Like, what if you had longitudinal data of your blood pressure over 6 to 12 months leading up to your visit with your primary care physician? You may think very differently about how you would treat hypertension, or even if you have hypertension. And those are simple examples. Imagine how that works with somebody who has, a far more complex chronic condition, where there are a lot of different data points that you can create a more sophisticated model around. So I think the place we need to figure out is how to gather that data, how to create the analysis, and then probably most importantly is how do you integrate it into the clinical workflow. That's where we see most companies sort of failing, is like, there's all kinds of cool stuff out there, but how do you put it in practice without changing behavior? Because if you change provider behavior, good luck. It's really, really, really hard to do. It's harder to change consumer behavior too, but like doubly hard to go to a physician and say, by the way, we want to change the way you're practicing medicine. Here are 3 new data points you never had before that to convince you are of clinical import. And now here's how you make decisions based on that. That's really challenging. So I still think we have work to do to figure out the workflow integration and decision support services around it so that we can use this data in a proactive way. You're talking about people who've never had access to these kinds of data, right? It's like, it's not that they haven't had it, they just haven't had this volume from this many different sources in a holistic view. So it's very new in terms of being able to practice medicine with all of this insight. In fact, some cases are, can be very overwhelming. In other cases, can be really empowering.
No, absolutely. Very, very well said, Robert, because personally, I have also faced the same thing where you go, provider looks at point in time and he says, hey, you know what, you have to do these things. But if they look at the data over the period of a year, probably it's just I had 2 more coffees which jumped up my blood pressure, right? So that's very apt. The other thing which you said is very important, right? There's the many organizations in the industry who are trying to do, But it's often said a vision without an action is hallucination, right? If they don't make it as an actionable insight, it's not going to lead anywhere. So very aptly put, Robert. What do you say, Sahab, on the data and how it could be harnessed, and how are you seeing data being leveraged properly in your organization?
Yeah, I'll share my personal experience. So I was using Peloton, and I don't know, for out of no reason, I pulled my old data and downloaded my data and just threw it in Tableau. And I started looking at correlation, and I noticed that I never thought that it would be true, that my heart rate was much higher in live classes versus regular classes that I would just take on my own. And interestingly enough, a few months later, Peloton released a live session, a fake live session that you can have like a bunch of people come in at any time, and they will group them together. And it's not really a live class, but it's a mock-up of live class. So I'm pretty sure like they must have seen some trends and saying, hey, when you have a live class, riders behave a bit differently, or maybe they're more pumped up. So these kind of data becomes very important, because when you're continuously looking and finding patterns that can actually improve the patient's experience in a digital therapeutics, that's where the huge value is. Another example that I would say is that if you want to try cognitive behavioral therapy and you don't have like the funds to go and see a therapist, and your doctor just recommended you a book to read on it, like, hey, this is the maybe a book on certain things, you can just read it. You're just reading, and you can put it away reading halfway through and decided not to read it anymore. But if it's like an application like Noom, which is based on cognitive behavioral therapy, if you don't use it for a few days, it will send you a nudge. And it's continuously looking at your data, it's looking at your rate, and there's a coach component in there that it's looking, there's a person looking at the data as well. And kind of customizing some of the experience for you based on that. So I think the value of data comes in terms of that it can actually be used to affect the behavior of the patient or the users. That's a benefit to them. And also, and I would just reiterate what Robert said. If you go and take these data points to a physician, this is one of the challenges I think that is out there. Physician would be like, do I need to look at this another data point? Am I being reimbursed to look at this new data point? So it's if you look at the consumer apps, they work very well, but whenever it comes to, unless it's integrated in their EHR and they can bill for looking at the data point, they may not even be interested in looking at that. So those are and patients don't know how to verbalize those kind of things in a clinical way for physicians to be for it to be useful. So that's, I think, one of the challenges there. But the potential is great if we can bridge that of communicating what patients collect to the physician. There is a huge value there.
Makes sense. And Zina, you talked a lot about interaction, right? You talked a lot about that you got to understand your members' patients better, right? And use that to improve it. And they are the ones which are generating the most of the data. So I believe you are a firm believer of the fact that that interaction is going to lead to a lot of improvement in quality of life. What's your perspective on it?
Yeah, absolutely, Vaibhav. And I think, that's key. Whether, if you go to definitions, it's really interesting. And a tip to Lavanga also with really looking at the health consumer as a definition, right? As which, when I saw that was very inspiring to me in what I'm doing, because, it's really looking at things from a whole different angle. Traditionally, people will approach a project of, well, is this a prescription project or a prescription indication, or is this OTC? Will it be OTCable? Does it even need to be registered? All of these things. And I think, again, you go back to basics. Well, don't worry about what it is or what classification it's going to be. What do you want it to do? What are you actually trying to do, right? And then let's figure out what it is in terms of the regulatory route. because otherwise you could be shortchanging and really going away from what you're actually intending. And then you end up testing something that's actually not what you were actually aiming for. So I think that that's key. And when it comes to consumer engagement, consumer patient, I think sometimes becomes synonymous if you're really thinking about self-care and at-home care, out of the hospital, out of the clinic. That engagement, and Robert and Sahab both talked about it as well, is just absolutely key, because you're looking at behavior change and how much your product requires that change of behavior is going to inform how complex it's going to be, right? And I think you then have to really understand, how are you going to encourage the user to change their behavior? And some prompts and stuff that Sahab was talking about can be useful. There's gamification aspects. Are our users actually responding to that? Is that engaging or is it annoying, right? Is it going to actually help to change behavior? And I think from a user perspective, if you can see that you are getting a benefit, that encourages you to keep using it. And I think an example from a digital therapeutic standpoint or biomarker standpoint, a great example recently is DIME getting together with in a pharma consortium to look at atopic dermatitis and eczema, and looking at a biomarker on nocturnal scratch, which if you have this condition, that is such a compelling outcome to look at, because if you can show evidence that is lessening with the therapy, that's something that the patient can really understand, and that's something that's a very meaningful outcome. But how do you get biomarkers to be standardized and accepted as a regulatory measure for evidence, for approval? And I think that's where you just have to get out and do it, and get out and test. And the more that try to use these biomarkers and tests, that evidence drives confidence. And confidence drives standardization. Standardization drives harmonization and regulatory reliance on what standards you would have to use on your therapy. So I think, as Robert was saying in the beginning, we are in the early stages and there's a lot to do, and this is very complex, but the opportunity is massive. And I think it's just a caution on not making it overly complicated as much as you can, really looking at what is that specific outcome you're looking for, and how can I approach those measurements that can then give you a better sense of how do you evaluate the opportunity from a business standpoint, I think, as well. Does it require an ecosystem, a surround sound, for telemedicine or some other aspects? Is it not just going to sit in user interface only? Do you need that surround sound? I think that's also critical. And one last thing I think is, in another discussion, it became aware to me that the healthcare system is very confused on something that's a wellness app or something that's an approved digital therapeutic, because if a physician endorses a wellness app, does that mean that it's prescribed? Well, that just, it's not about the regulatory classification, but it's about how the user is advised on what to use. Now, how much are we expecting the physicians and the healthcare system to understand all these different tools? So that can also, keep in mind in terms of the surround sound and ecosystem.
Understood. So that brings a follow-up question in my mind, right? With so many complexities and variables, how difficult or easy it is to frame I would say, business case and get approvals from the organizations to invest into it? Because there's so many variables, there's so many unknowns. it's very dependent on the adoption, how the people are adopting or the digital consumer is adopting it. How difficult is it to get approvals on these based on the business cases that can be put across? Maybe Robert, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So I think I have two different perspectives on it. One is, I always think it's important for us to understand the difference between evolutionary and revolutionary. And we think that the revolutionary over the long term will have the biggest impact from a system perspective. It also has the most friction in seeing the light of day. And so to your point is that the near-term value props and the way you design business models that are success are, how do you make it slide easily into the existing framework? We talk about following the money, right? So find a way as a company to put yourself in the existing funds flow with as little friction as possible. That's the best way to get to market today, fast, right? If you're trying to create new CPT codes, new reimbursement models, new value-based care payment models, like all of these things need to happen, but it's a slow march. You know, this is an industry that doesn't change very easily. And so what I see repeatedly are companies that have, you know, grandiose expectations and frequently come back and say, yeah, I know I really want to put together this value-based solution. There's a lot of shared savings to be had, but gosh, the market I'm in is still largely fee for service. And so my response to that is then you need to know how to coexist in both. You need to know how today to be viable, to exist in a fee for service world with a pathway to testing out risk-based models. I mean, that's just the pragmatic side of things. It's it's hard to go to market with something that is so new and novel and unfamiliar for healthcare without the system just sort of spitting you out right now. It gets easier if you're not touching the regulatory world or the provider world. Interestingly enough, I know it seems a little counterintuitive, we spend a lot of time looking for companies and helping our companies find ways to avoid the existing system. Right? Like at Livongo, we used to feel like it was a failure if somebody had to go and see their endocrinologist. Like the goal was to keep you out of the office of the endo, keep you out of the ED, you know, keep you out of the provider, you know, system. Like the minute you get sucked into the hospital, it's expensive, it's scary, it's anxiety producing. You know, you get tests and procedures. Like I was talking to some GI docs a little while ago, and they were saying something like 97% of patients who go to a gastroenterologist end up with a procedure of some sort. I don't know about the medical necessity of all of those, but I know they're expensive. You know, I know a colonoscopy can be anywhere between $1,500 and $10,000, and that there's a pretty big co-insurance component of that. So I think part of the viability is to start off by trying to fit within the existing supply chain and follow the money. You know, like going back to our pharma topic, which we're talking about today. I mean, I hate to be a cynic here, but I am, and I remind myself on a pretty regular basis that pharma companies make money selling drugs, and don't forget it, right? And so if you want to measure impact, like driving adherence, adherence is good for pharma companies. It sells more meds. That makes profits. It makes public markets happy. Like that's a sad, cold reality, but there is a little bit of a mercenary view to this market. That's not to say that pharma companies are inherently bad. That's just to say like, this is their bread and butter. This is their core business. And they have good intentions about expanding the universe of whole patient care and creating digital solutions beyond the pill. But they're not going to cannibalize their core business very easily, right? And so, you know, you need to figure out how you're accretive to the process, not right now cannibalistic. These are just like market realities, you know. So going to a pharma company and say, we've got a solution that is revenue generating, you're going to get a pretty good ear to it. You know, going to them and saying, you've got a threat to a multi-billion-dollar drug franchise, you're going to get a cold ear to it. So I think those are sort of the pragmatic ways I think about it, you know. And then the other question is time to market, right? So we see a lot of bifurcated strategies where people are going with sort of a wellness approach to start, and then backing up into the regulated approach, right? Because one's faster to market, you know, and you can get it out there without having to go through the same pathways. And especially on the digital health side, I think the jury's still out on prescribed, regulated, reimbursed digital therapeutics. I think we're in the investment phase, right? Like everybody's putting money into that sector, trying to prove out the models, get the reimbursement, demonstrate efficacy. And, you know, it's going to take a while until we see really great stuff come out of the end of the pipeline. I mean, I'm really grateful for the payers and the Achilles of the world who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to pave those roads, because we need people to do that. But I think if you look at what's come out of those efforts today, relative to the size of the problems, it's still pretty small. Now, I think opportunity is huge, and I'm glad they're doing it, but I think we just need to be realistic about the timeframes involved.
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. I wish we had 30 more minutes. It's an interesting conversation. Thank you all for, but we have 5 more minutes left. I wanted to kind of close out with one final question for each one of you. And where do you think the realistic future of digital health lies in the pharma ecosystem? For each one of you. We'll start with maybe Sahab and then.
Yeah, I think it's there. I think companies are catching up. But if you look at the early digital health space, you know, from 5 years ago, their go-to plan used to be go to employers, get it on the, you know, get it on the plan so the employers can, you know, pay, reimburse. And but now it's shifting. Pharmas are catching up. I think I think it depends on the, it won't be everything, as Robert said. There is going to be certain things that is, you know, like drug replacement. I'm right now using a DTX that helps me not use the drug, right? So there's always going to be certain things that may not be of an interest or may become an interest if that's the, you know, direction they want to go in. But the one that I'm on is not reimbursed by insurance. It's a self-pay or employer pay. So there is still, you know, until the whole ecosystem has to come along for it to actually work. You have to have health systems come along, you have to have pharma come along, and you have to have payers come along for it to actually work. And there's still, you know, technological issues like integrating into the EHR is one of the biggest issue. Like how do you integrate it in there? It's, you know, so there's a lot of complexity before it, you know, we will have, you know, a system where we will see pharma doing a lot of it, but it is going to happen. It's bound to happen because that's where, you know, the healthcare system is going.
Great. Zina, what's your thoughts? Where is the future in pharma?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The future, I think, is undeniable. But it's going to be a complex road, and it's not going to be a straight line. But I think what's important is, and it's not going to be linear necessarily, right? When you're looking at different data points, it's not necessarily linear to the business value. There might be a combination of things like we talked about that then has that curve of benefit. I think if you look from a regulatory standpoint, you know, there certainly regulators are looking at frameworks to enable digital therapeutics and digital tools to come forward with different classes and wellness and software as medical device, and also looking at acknowledging that the pace of innovation is much quicker than it is with your standard, you know, pills, right? So think about beyond the pill. And regulators are looking at how do they adapt the regulatory system to fit with the pace of this innovation cycle. So if you look at AI tools and things like this, it's got to be a lot more real time, a lot more flexible, a lot more agile, you know, based on perhaps sometimes technical platforms to really have a more efficient, reliable regulatory system. And so I think those conversations are happening, and that is happening. And you see breakthrough devices, breakthrough coming through with digital therapeutics, which I think is a great evidence of how things are that this is going to be part of the future. It's a matter of how does that fit into this broader aspect of reimbursement and payers. And just because you have a digital therapeutic approval doesn't mean that people are actually going to use it well or interact with it well. And I think from a consumer perspective, when you saw, the Apple Watch come out and earlier the same year, 23andMe cancer risk tests, press release from FDA was, this is to empower the consumer with health information, right? These are disease states of cancer and cardiac aspects. So how is that OTC? Well, it's OTC because it's empowering the consumer with information to go talk to their doctor. So then you have interaction with the consumer directly with digital tools, but then how does that inform how the consumer becomes a patient and talks to the healthcare professional? Healthcare professionals need to understand what these tools are and what they mean so that they can actually make the assessments and go forward. So I think it's experiential. It's just going to, have to keep going at it. So, DIME and other organizations and DTA are really, I think those are needed so that, biomarkers and other standards of evidence and design methods come through that as a whole can amplify the tools that can be talked to with regulators, because innovation shapes regulations and regulators need something to react to, and that can help inform payers, I think, as well on the benefits. And it's a web, and you just have to keep providing the evidence.
Thank you. Pretty exhaustive. Final comments, Robert, from you?
The only thing I'd say is I think largely we're in a phase where there's a battle for consumer trust, right? That the provider is inherently the most trusted part in the ecosystem. The payer has aspirations of being that. Pharma does too. And I think we're going to see one of the things that digital health does is create another avenue to build a relationship with the consumer. And, it feels to me like everybody's trying to create trust so that we as consumers think of company A, B, C, and D, or health system or payer as our ally, as our advocate, as our front door to the system. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out and whether or not the providers can be displaced. There's a lot of effort and a lot of money going into it. And in digital health, in some respects, these digital tools seem to be having a little bit of a leveling impact. Like it democratizes access to resources in a way that didn't exist before. So it should be fun to watch.
Absolutely, it will be. But thank you, all of you, for your time. It was a great session, and we look forward to these dialogues in future. Stay well. Thank you.
Okay.
Julia, back to you.
Thank you very much, Vaibhav, and everybody who's been on the panel so far today, and especially this session just now. Thank you guys for your time, for your energy, and yeah, hope you enjoyed being part of the HITLAB Summit.